Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Inseparable, the original Siamese twins and their rendezvous with American history, by Yunte Huang, read by P.J. Ochlan. Preface. The focus of Inseparable is the extraordinary life of Chang and Eng Bunker, the original Siamese twins, who, by virtue of their physical anomaly, were seen as freaks, subhuman, or as Victor Hugo so devastatingly couched it in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, an almost. An odd pair, they beat impossible odds, touring the world, making money, getting married, and having children. Better yet, they did all of this with grit and gusto. It feels like a cliché to say that their story is an example of the triumphant human spirit. This is the kind of trope you might find in a high school primer. For their experience actually not only questions what it means to be a human, but also examines the outer limits of living one's own life and dying one's own death. As the cornerstone of liberal democracy, individualism is not capable of defining, or conversely, confining, the conjoined life of the Siamese twins. To them, being human meant being more than one, inseparable from the other, never alone in life, death, happiness, pain, procreation, or even in answering the call of nature. They defy what Leslie Fiedler once called the tyranny of the normal, a cultural malaise the eminent literary critic cogently denounced. Writing this book at a historical moment when we see, once again, a rising tide of human disqualification, of looking at others as less than human or normal, has given me an acute sense of urgency. My concern has much less to do with partisan kibitzing, yes, a very un-Chinese word, than with the disquieting fact that, in the words of the great Yogi Berra, it's like déjà vu all over again. The fact that this remarkable story commences in the age of Jacksonian democracy and gathers steam at the apex of American humbuggery is not an insignificant aspect of my book. Although P.T. Barnum, much to his chagrin, did not play a key role in Chang and Eng's career, the Prince of Humbugs was, in fact, a mover and shaker of American popular culture in his time, the progenitor of an industry that entertained and exploited and made money out of displaying curiosities, be they freaks, wonders, beauties, or beasts. Even the glitzy beauty pageant today has its origin in the 19th century freak show, as niftily orchestrated by Barnum. Or, for that matter, the film industry also began in the freak show, before making the transition to projecting beautiful faces or beautified illusions, and part of the cinema's power persists with shock and awe. As history reveals, the success of the freak show, indubitably the birthplace of American mass entertainment, relied not only on the ingenuity and sacrifice of superb showmen like the Siamese twins, but also on the braggadocio and charlatanism of impresarios, or carnival barkers, who enticed crowds via sales puffery and manipulation of public opinion. Barnum once said to the effect that the American people loved to be entertained and humbugged, or, more bluntly, according to some, there's a sucker born every minute. As I relate in Inseparable, it would contribute very little to our understanding of American culture if we were simply to dismiss Barnum and his ilk as conniving charlatans or Yankee peddlers. We need to recognize a humbug as a trickster, a confidence man who is not necessarily the devil, even though he often traffics in devilish ways. Being tricked by a con man, as Herman Melville reminded us long ago in The Confidence Man, is a price we pay in the confidence game called democracy. It is worth noting, then, that the boom of the freak show as humbuggery coincided with the rise of the common man during the Jacksonian Age, an era that nowadays some see as approximate to our own. When everyone feels entitled to an opinion, but cannot, by virtue of ignorance or innocence, tell the difference between a gag and a gem, between what showbiz calls gaffed freaks and born freaks, the confidence man swoops in to make you feel better while he takes your money, or outright steals your soul. In this sense, the freak show, which lies at the heart of Chang and Eng's story, is not just about looking at others as less human. To borrow a concept from the eminent anthropologist Clifford Geertz, a freak show is a deep play. Or, in the streetwise lingo of a humbug, it is the long game. Brushing against the grain of American individualism, democracy, and humbuggery, the story of Chang and Eng is also complicated by their imbroglio with the institution of chattel slavery, miscegenation, and a host of other incendiary issues that roiled 19th century America. Virtually sold into slavery, they would later own and trade slaves themselves. Having married two white sisters, an unusual union denigrated as bestial by some penny press editors, they might also have fathered children with their own slave women. As slave-holding Southern gentry, they stood staunchly with the Confederacy in the epic fight against the Yankees, who once exploited them. All these narrative strands, in varying shades of verity and plausibility, make their biography more complex even than the short, fleshy band that so famously connected them. The legacy of Chang and Eng, not surprisingly, survives far beyond their death. I don't just mean the longevity of their brand name, which now applies to every pair of conjoined twins, or the thriving Bunker clan, their proud descendants numbering more than 1,500 today, or their shared liver on permanent display as an anatomical curio at the Muta Museum in Philadelphia. As I will show at the conclusion of the book, after their story seems over, and no, I'm not giving away anything, we are surprised to find what we can call their Mayberry connection. Most fans of The Andy Griffith Show would know that Mayberry, the fictional setting for that most popular 1960s American rube-com, was based on Griffith's actual birthplace, Mount Airy, North Carolina. But, unknown to most, Mount Airy was also the adopted hometown of Chang and Eng, the place where they lived and died. It is fair to say that The Andy Griffith Show is supposedly about the American normal, Mayberry being a sleepy hamlet where everyone is kith or kin, an Arcadia where no trouble is too big for the amiable sheriff and his bungling deputy. The fortuitous coexistence of Andy Griffith and the Siamese twins, one representing the normal and the other the freakish, is a case of cultural symbiosis. It is a condition often forgotten or willfully ignored, as were any racial themes in what in fact appeared like Jim Crow-era Mayberry, which featured virtually no black character in its folksy haven. The norm, to paraphrase Fiedler, continues to tyrannize the abnormal, burying it deep underground into the granite foundation of America. Chang and Eng revolted against that tyranny, in part by mimicking it, and, in the course of their incredible life and beyond, revealed the inseparable tie between what's accepted as human and what's rejected as freakish. That is the story of the Siamese twins I want to tell. Prologue. A game on the high seas. It was supposed to be a routine voyage. The Cunard Royal Mail steamer Palmyra left Liverpool on July 30th, 1870, setting sail for New York City. Only 5 years earlier, the American Civil War had come to a close, with a loss of more than 600,000 lives. Not only had it ineradicably changed the nation and its way of being, it had also abolished the brutal institution of slavery and ended that tragic crossing known as the Middle Passage, a few thousand nautical miles to the south of the Palmyra's route. The burning embers that had erupted in the wake of General Sherman's march to the sea had long since cooled off, but the South remained bitter and defiant, mired in the slow and painful process known as Reconstruction. At the same time, the North, along with the rest of the country, was hurtling along at almost unchecked speed toward the future. Few seemed to heed the backwoodsman Henry David Thoreau's contrarian wisdom. Why the hurry? America was, in fact, in an existential hurry, with the iron horse, the train, leading the charge of economic expansion. The 1869 completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, built on the backs and lives of Irish and Chinese coolie laborers, had brought the nation together, at least spatially. New towns sprouted along newly laid railroad tracks, like bamboo shoots after a spring rain. Cattle kingdoms arose like tumbleweed in Texas and the Plains states. The dizzying pace of urban expansion and frenetic economic development had ushered in a new era in America, the Gilded Age. The Palmyra, built in 1866 to keep abreast of the exponential increase in transatlantic traffic, was a medium-sized steamship, 2,044 in tonnage, 260 in nominal horsepower, and a passenger capacity of 46 in cabin class and 650 in steerage. On this particular westward voyage, the Palmyra, under the command of Captain William Watson, carried 29 passengers in cabin class and 377 in steerage. A steamer like the Palmyra was a major improvement on a sailing ship, cutting the length of the transatlantic journey from an almost insufferable 8 weeks down to 2. However, these were the early days of cruise voyages, with conditions aboard still crude, if not primitive. Cabins were as small as a so-called cat's ear, dimly lit by a single candle. Passengers had to wash their own dishes. To get fresh milk, before the age of electricity and refrigerators, the company actually carried live cows aboard. To control rats, cats, which of course were oblivious to the class divisions of cabin and steerage, were taken along for the cruise. Charles Dickens, who had crossed the Atlantic nearly 3 decades earlier on the SS Britannia to visit the United States, complained bitterly of tasteless food, inebriated cooks, and cramped cabins, about which the famous novelist wrote, "Nothing smaller for sleeping in was ever made, except coffins." Mark Twain, the globetrotter who coined the term Gilded Age, blessed these newfangled steamships with an even more withering remark in his travel logs, characterizing the meals as plenty of good food furnished by the deity and cooked by the devil. Colorful derision aside, the customary seagoing fare was a far cry from what the steamship companies had advertised as the luxury of a cheerful, hospitable, and elegant floating hotel. On her second day at sea, as land faded on the horizon, the Palmyra glided toward the deep waters of the blue Sargasso Sea. The ship's strong prow sliced through the water like a cheese-cutting knife, spewing fierce foam into the air. After breakfast, cabin passengers began to mingle or disperse. Those who felt queasy went to their cabins, while others lingered behind, engaging in all sorts of trivial pursuits to while away their time. Mr. John H. Slatt, a middle-aged English businessman, strolled on deck with his cane and stared at the vast monotony of the ocean, reminiscing about his first trip to America on the Europa more than 20 years earlier. Mr. Jacob Segrange, a red-headed merchant, native of Luxembourg and now a proud resident of Fredonia, Wisconsin, lounged on a weather-worn deck chair, watching the vagaries of the clouds. Mrs. Rosa Prang, a Swiss blonde in her early 40s, took her 6-year-old nephew John to the stern rails to look for whales, porpoises, and sharks, which often frequented this part of the ocean. The boy was especially excited about seeing what the sailors called the Portuguese man-of-war, or nautilus, that might appear in the ocean in days ahead. Those mystical sea snails, of light violet color under the sun, would ascend to the surface, putting up small sails and using their tails as navigating rudders. But there was nothing to see that day under a gray sky, except for scattered whitecaps that could easily be mistaken for sightings of something else. In her earlier years, Mrs. Prang, née Gaba, had followed the footsteps of her brother and immigrated to America. On that trip from her native Switzerland to Paris, she had met a lanky young Prussian named Louis, whose deep blue eyes had followed her across the aisle as the crowded four-wheeled diligence rumbled through alpine mountain roads and flat French countryside. She had not thought much of him at the time, although she had been impressed by his story. He was running away from the Prussian police because he was a revolutionary radical. They went separate ways in Paris, and she set sail for America. 5 years later, when one day she was milking cows on her brother's farm in Ohio, she received a letter from Louis asking her to meet him in Boston and marry him. At the time, she had been entertaining a marriage proposal from a neighboring young farmer. Maybe it was Louis's piercing blue eyes, or maybe it was his radical ideas and foolish ways, but the letter tantalized her with a future that was at least more appealing than the certain monotony of being a farmer's wife. Without further reflection, Rosa sold her cows to pay for her fare and headed for Boston. The first few years of their marriage were hard financially. Louis had tried his hand at manufacturing stationery and leather goods, but he finally found his calling in wood engraving. In 1860, he founded L. Prang and Company, a brand that would soon become recognizable all over the world, for during the Civil War, the company sold millions of battleground maps and pictures of soldier heroes, living or dead. Unknown to Rosa, Louis's bigger reputation would still lie in the future. After the printing of greeting cards during the 1873 Christmas season, the man Rosa had chosen to marry in a leap of faith would become known in history as the father of the American Christmas card. Aboard the Palmyra, when little John became bored from watching the ocean, Rosa took him to the saloon on the quarterdeck. As they entered, she saw a strange scene unfolding, almost like a stage play. Though the windows were open to let in the fresh air, the saloon door had remained shut to avoid sudden drafts. Without thorough ventilation, the strong smell of tobacco mixed with the ocean's salty tang. Mr. and Mrs. Herman and Honorja Oli and their cousin were playing whist at a table with Mr. James Beresford, an English merchant now living in Ohio. Earlier at breakfast, Rosa had chatted with Beresford and his wife Elizabeth about the Midwestern state where she had once milked cows. The unacknowledged center of attention in the room, however, was a quiet chess game being played at another table. One player, a comely black man in his 50s, wearing a black suit and a bow tie, looked dignified, almost regal. The other player, or strictly speaking, the other two, looked Asian. Wiry men getting on in years, with salt and pepper hair, they had deeply wrinkled faces that resembled maps of Asia. They wore identical, elegantly tailored suits, and most surprising of all, they appeared to have been sewn together. The distinguished black man, as hard as he tried to focus on the game, could not help but steal sidelong glances at the conjoined pair sitting across the chessboard. His attention was secretly drawn to the fleshy cord that connected the twins, an object of curiosity that had in fact tantalized millions worldwide who had flocked to exhibition halls, museums, ballrooms, pitched tents, or county fairgrounds to witness the famously proclaimed lusus naturae, freak of nature. The twins, who had withstood all probing gazes over the years, whether from queens or counselors, princes or paupers, did not particularly heed the black man's stealthy stare, nor did they mind the curious looks from fellow passengers, who all seemed to be absorbed in their own business of distilling boredom, drop by drop. Before the Cunard Steamship Company had adopted strict policies regarding passenger conduct, the saloon on the quarterdeck used to be much noisier. Musicians, theatrical troupes, and minstrels on tour would perform loudly and freely. Itinerant preachers and other evangelizing speakers would also take the opportunity to deliver speeches, trying to save some souls or change a few minds. According to company records, all this changed after a memorable disturbance had occurred in 1846. That year, as the Cunard Company record shows, one Frederick Douglass, a man of color, came from America in the Cambria, then commanded by Captain Judkins, for the purpose of speaking and lecturing in England on the abolition of slavery. Being a second cabin passenger, he had not the privilege of the quarterdeck. But on the last day, after the saloon dinner, he went aft among the first-class passengers and delivered himself of a bitter discourse on abolition. A large circle of his supporters gathered round him to hear his speech. Those who differed from him also listened with great patience for some time. A New Orleans man, the master of a ship in the China trade, and who had been during the greater part of the voyage, and was more particularly on this occasion very much intoxicated, poked himself into the circle, walked up to the speaker, with his hands in his pockets and a quid of tobacco in his mouth, looked at him steadily for a minute, and then said, "I guess you're a liar." The Negro replied with something equally complimentary, and a loud altercation ensued between them. Pretty soon a melee broke out between enraged supporters of the opposing sides, who were scattered into a dozen stormy groups about the deck. The chaos lasted for almost an hour, until the captain, with the aid of military officers aboard, finally lulled the tempest and separated the contending parties. In the middle of the tumult, as the anonymous company record-keeper noted, referring to Douglass, this demon of discord had vanished. Thereafter, the Cunard Steamship Company issued strict regulations on passenger conduct to prevent the possible recurrence of such an affair. Since then, the saloon and quarterdeck had become much quieter, and indeed boring, as typified by this moment on the Palmyra. One of the twins, unfortunately we don't know which one, was absorbed in the game against the gentleman. He took a long, satisfying pull on a cigar after thoughtfully moving a piece on the board, while the other turned his face away, almost instinctively, as he had done all his life, allowing his twin brother to have his fun. Both twins were said to be excellent at chess, a game they had learned on their first voyage to the New World, almost a lifetime earlier. But they did not like playing in opposition to each other, because it would be, as they put it, no more fun than playing with the right hand against the left. Over the years, they had made a pact. If one plays chess, the other will stay quiet and mind his own business. In fact, due to their unique physical condition, even a simple call of nature would have to be answered in the brotherly presence of the other. They had a pact for everything they did: eating, drinking, sleeping, dressing, washing, conversing, traveling, performing, fighting, hunting, and yes, love-making. Doctors even suspected that they might dream similar dreams, or versions of the same, like musical variations. Their suave opponent turned out to be none other than Edward James Roy, newly elected president of Liberia. Born on February 3, 1815, in the small town of Newark, Ohio, Roy was the son of a fugitive slave who had escaped from Kentucky and ended up managing a ferry service on the Wabash River in Indiana. As a child, Roy was fortunate to be among the few colored kids admitted to the local schools in Ohio. According to one biographer, when Roy gained admittance to Newark High School, his teacher was Salmon Portland Chase, who by 1870 became Chief Justice of the United States. Despite his decent education, Roy began work after high school as a barber, considered a most suitable occupation for a black man at the time. Newark would not have its first white barber until 1856. He then attended Ohio University in Athens. A few years later, Roy followed in his father's footsteps and set out westward, settling down also in Terre Haute, where he bought properties, operated a barber shop, and established the first bathhouse in town. Although his business prospered, Roy was disheartened to find that 19th century America was not, if it ever would be, a great place for a free black man. When fortunate enough to be unencumbered by chattel slavery, free blacks were not lucky enough to be free from discrimination, segregation, violence, and the malicious suspicion that their presence posed a threat to the purity of white blood and a temptation to those still bound in slavery. Ever since the birth of the Republic, the question of what to do with free blacks mingling with white populations had puzzled the Founding Fathers. In 1782, Thomas Jefferson, a hardy worrier over miscegenation, but hardly a warrior fighting it, suggested a solution that would gain increasing support in the country: removing free blacks beyond the reach of mixture. Slavery is evil, so reasoned this champion of the natural rights of man and an unapologetic owner of slaves. But abolishing human bondage would pose a greater danger of racial commingling. This fear coincided with the other worry shared by slaveholders. The existence of free blacks would have a corrupting influence on those still in chains. Removing free and freed blacks from the United States, as Jefferson suggested, became a magic bullet. Spearheaded by the American Colonization Society, ACS, a movement to plant a colony in West Africa gained traction, leading to the birth of Liberia, first as a colony for American settlers in 1822, and then as a new nation in 1847. Unnerved by the worsening race relations in America and lured by the promise of a new start in a free land, Roy joined thousands of African Americans sponsored by the ACS to settle in Liberia. After his arrival there in 1846, Roy, a man of considerable acumen, enjoyed a meteoric rise in the newly founded Republic of Liberia. He first made a fortune in shipping and brokerage, then turned to law and politics, winning election to the Supreme Court. After 2 years, he was advanced to Chief Justice. A few months prior to his Palmyra voyage to New York, Roy had been elected President of Liberia. He had just traveled to England, trying to negotiate a loan from London bankers, and now he was on his way to the United States, his native land, to raise funds for building a railroad in his adopted country. But as he would soon find out upon landing, the America of 1870, basking in the glow of the Gilded Age, was still no place for a black man, presidential or not. As the New York Daily Tribune reported on August 17, 1870, Roy...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?